What's up, everyone? My name is Michael, known online as Fedor_8. You might recognize my screen name for having coached on HUSNG.com before Black Friday and having played the $220 turbos on Full Tilt Poker. So I'm glad to say I'm back, and I'm looking forward to working with a lot of you and sharing my experiences and my knowledge. So I have made the transition from $220 turbos, so pretty high stake turbos, to the hypers. So I'm currently playing hyper turbo heads up sit and goes, and I just wanted to share with you some of the adjustments I've made and basically take you into my poker tracker and show you some of the matches I've played recently and give you some explanations behind some of the decisions I've made. So I'm going to be showing you a couple of matches I've played against random opponents. I've blocked the name of our opponents because it's going to be versus an unknown player, Readless. So I'm going to go ahead and just give you a quick review here. I'm going to do a couple matches in this video, and I hope you enjoy it. So first hand of the match here, pick up a pair of jacks. Pretty easy hand to play. Go ahead and make a raise. My opponent calls. My opponent checks the flop, and I go ahead and make a continuation bet. I'm definitely going to go ahead and bet for value on this board. Pretty dry board, some draws, and I also think it's a good board for me to go ahead and make a continuation bet on for value because it's such a low card board, 10-3 deuce. I think it could also induce a lot of check raise bluffs from certain opponents. So definitely a spot where I want to see a check raise, and at that point I'd be getting it in. And I also think a lot of players would be just floating on this board or just calling with some marginal value. So I go ahead and make a continuation bet. I get called. My opponent checks the turn, and I'll go ahead and barrel again for value. And my opponent calls as well. And on the river, my opponent checks, and now we get to a certain situation where we bet the flop, we bet the turn, and we have to decide if we want to bet again for value. And I think it really comes down to understanding what our opponent could call us with, and if there's any room for him to call with an inferior value hand, or if our bet here is going to fold out a lot of marginal value and only get either check raised by a made hand or a hand that has us beat. So you need to understand his range here, and is he going to call you with, let's say he had a pair of 10s on the flop, is he going to call you with top pair here, or is he going to be folding top pair on this very wet board? If you figure out that he's only going to be calling you with two pair or better, two pair, trips, flush, or straight, then there's really no reason to go ahead and bet. And if you think you're going to be folding out only worse hands, then again, there's really no reason to bet here. So once you make that analysis based on the player you're playing, you can make your decision as to whether you're going to check back or whether you're going to go ahead and make a small value bet. At this point, I go ahead and check behind the river because, like I said, I just don't see him calling me enough with a hand that's worse than a pair of jacks. So I think if he called me on the flop with a 3, a pair of 3s, or a pair of 2s, I think he's going to be folding it by now. And I think a lot of players would also be folding a pair of 10s here. Just because of the amount of pressure I've put on the opponent and the run out of this board. It's really not favorable for him to be calling with very marginal hands. So the only way I think he's going to be calling me here is if he improved on the turn or on the river and has me beat, where he's going to either check call or check raise with a better hand than jacks. And don't forget, like, he can have two pair in this spot and still be check calling. It's not, the check on the river is not necessarily a complete weakness. We must consider that our pair of jacks isn't the strongest hand at the moment, simply because of the run out. And the board is not really encouraging hands like two pair or 3 of a kind to go ahead and make a value bet here. So I think those hands are going to be bluff catching, and it's just too much of a marginal spot for me to be betting my pair of jacks. So I check behind, and I'm good. I hold. So my opponent called me on the flop with Queen 7, so I was pretty accurate in assessing that it's a good board for floats. As you can see, he went ahead and floated me on the flop. On the turn, he picked up a flush draw and decided to call me again. And then by the river, none of his draws came through. And as you can see, if I would have went ahead and make a value bet, yes, I'm ahead, but he just can't call. There's not much that he can call me with that I beat, basically. So all his air is going to fold, all his marginal value is going to fold. And I can only see myself being called by a better hand than jacks, potentially. I mean, if you're playing an absolute fish who's going to call you with any pair here, then go ahead and make a value bet. But consider that your sizing needs to be smaller than usual. You can't go ahead and make a pot size bet and expect to be called by marginal value, right? If he has a very marginal hand and you assess that and you put him on a very marginal hand, you have to also consider the sizing and say, if I make a pot size bet or if I shove the river to look like a bluff, am I really inducing a call by very marginal hands? If you think he's very weak, then you need to be able to make a bet that reflects that so that he can call with those weak hands. If you make a large bet that's going to fold out weak hands, then again, it's really counterproductive. It doesn't really encourage those hands to call. So a pretty good hand. I mean, for the first hand of the match, obviously we'll take it. So the next hand, King 5 suited out of position. My opponent limps in, and I just decide to check it back. I think it's pretty common. We flop bottom pair, and we check. I don't necessarily think it's the right place to go ahead and lead out. Yes, we have a strong bottom pair, but I just don't think we can get called by too much value. I think checking this hand on the flop might be better than leading out. I think if we lead out and we get called wide, it's going to be a problematic hand later on on the turn or river. So I think this hand plays better as a check call hand or a potential showdown / bluff catch hand for now. The turn is a deuce, and at this point, I'm going to go ahead and make a value bet. I think the number of hands you can have has increased, as well as the fact that he showed weakness on the flop. I think my fives are going to play better against that kind of a range than if I just donk bet into him on the flop readless or with no information. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and make a bet, try to get some equity share to be folded out, as well as get called by some draws potentially, maybe some floats or some worse pairs. So my opponent calls, and the river's a 7. So at this point, I think I have a pure bluff catch hand. Really no reason for me to go ahead and barrel this river. I think I'd be turning my hand into a bluff more than anything. So I think it's a hand that could play well as a bluff catcher. And so I check the river, and my opponent bets 140. So he almost bets two times the size of the pot. And at that point, I'm just gonna let it go and fold. So I think I played this hand okay. I just think circumstance didn't let me get to a showdown, although I believe that I probably played it as best as I could against this player. And it's okay to go ahead and make a fold here. It's just such a tough spot with such a large bet that I think it's a high risk situation for no reason at this point. So next hand, 3-6 offsuit. I go ahead and limp, and my opponent checks back. My opponent checks the flop here, and I'm going to go ahead and make a bet. Draws, pretty dry board, flush draw, straight draw, and I got a pair with a spade as well. So I think that's important to note. And I also think a lot of something people don't consider too often is their kicker. If you have blockers or if you have backdoor draws, I think that also plays quite well when assessing our opponent's range and trying to figure out what they could have. So when you have a hand that has a blocker like the 6 of spades, for example, so you have part of the flush draw, you have part of the straight draw potentially on the turn and river. I definitely think it's something to acknowledge, especially when we have a pair here. I think it's definitely a bet in position, which is also key, and we get called. So the turn's an 8. We get a check, and again, I'm going to go ahead and bet for value here. I don't see him just floating me on the flop with an 8. I think that's the main thing we need to keep in mind, is that if he had top pair here, or even 2 pair, I think most of my opponents are going to be check raising with that kind of a hand. So when the turn pairs with the 8, it encourages me to think that my 3 is good, more than if I would have got check raised on the flop, obviously. So at that point, I decided to go ahead and make a bet a little bigger than half the size of the pot to try to get some additional value from him. And we get min raised. So he check min raises us on the turn, and I decide to call because, again, I don't think he has too much here. I think the way he's playing this hand could mean a flush draw, because he just check called the flop. So I think it's interesting because obviously our hand is marginal. It's by no means is this an easy call or is this going to facilitate play on the river. It's going to be quite a tough spot come the river as well, and even on the turn it's not the easiest of spots because our hand is so weak. I mean, yes, we have a pair of threes with a 6 kicker on a paired board, so it's not terrible, but I think a lot of people would shy away from this spot because of the marginal nature of it and the fact that we got check min raised on the turn. So I decided to call because I do think that I'm in a decent spot here, and I decided to call and reevaluate the river. And on the river, we get a brick, in my opinion. Nothing like really improves hands that I think he might have had on the flop. Mainly some spades, potentially a 4-5, 5-6 hand, ace-4 hand. Fortunately for us, we get a check, and I think it's going to really make things a lot easier for us than if he would have jammed the river. So at this point, I just check back again, and my opponent had 10-7, so he did have a bluff. He had some overcards, and the fact that he rivered showdown value allowed him to check and call, or plan on checking and calling, and it really didn't make things too difficult for us on the river. I think if we were in his shoes, I do still like a shove, just because, I mean, if we did have an 8 and we would bet the flop, I don't think we would just be floating the turn or just calling the turn after getting check min raised with an 8. I do think it's a decent trap spot, however, but against most opponents who are recreationals, I just don't think they would be playing it this way. And I kind of think my opponent lost value here with his 10-7. If I were him, I would probably bet fold the river or just jam the river and seeing what would have happened. But yeah, I think we played it okay. Again, we had the right assessment that we were ahead with our pair of threes, and most importantly, we were calling and betting when we were ahead. And as soon as we were behind there when he rivered his 10, we didn't invest any more value or any more chips when behind. So that's something to consider as well. Like, a lot of people get frustrated when they see this 10 hit the river and they lose the pot, and they're like, "Ah, I run so bad." But keep in mind that yes, he does have equity share in this pot, so he does have some equity. He will win this hand sometimes. It's not drawing dead. And most importantly, think of how you played the hand. Like, we bet the flop when we were ahead. We bet the turn and called the raise when we were ahead. And then when we were behind, with 0% to win this pot on the river, we checked. We didn't invest anything. So you kind of played, consider how you play the hand and when you put the chips in, and just be happy with the fact that, okay, I got all my bets and all my calls were done when I was ahead, and as soon as I was behind, I didn't invest anymore. So you kind of played the hand extremely well. So keep that in mind and encourage yourself by thinking along those lines. I think it's going to help you stay positive as well, instead of dwelling on the fact that he rivered a 10. So I think it's a different way of thinking, something that has helped me stay positive, and especially when you're playing a high variance game, I think it's important to understand the fact that your opponent does have equity. He is going to river you. He's going to turn better hands sometimes. Just because you're ahead on the flop or turn doesn't mean he's drawing dead and has no outs. Just think about how you invest your chips when you're making calls and when you're making raises, and if you're doing that when you're ahead. And if you are, then you're going to do great in the long term. So just keep that in mind and stay motivated and stay encouraged by thinking like that. So for example, in this hand, like I said, we bet the flop, bet the turn, call the raise when we were ahead, and then as soon as we were behind, we didn't invest any more chips. So I think that's important. So we're back to about 16 big blinds here. I haven't really been talking about stack sizes or big blinds because I think it's pretty obvious that it's right here at the top, 16, and it's something I've been looking at throughout the whole match. So I might have ignored it because it's an obvious thing to me. So just to mention that we are always considering the amount of big blinds in play and making our decisions, pre-flop decisions, based on that especially. So always consider the context of the situation. Context meaning opponent. Is he a reg? Is he a recreational? Is he a winning player? Is he a big losing player? How many big blinds? What stakes you're playing? These are all things or situations that make up context. And it's really important when analyzing the situation is understanding the context. So I get a lot of people who come up to me, or students who come up to me and say, "Hey Mike, I had ace king and my opponent raised, and I wasn't sure if I should shove or if I should just call." And I'm like, wait a minute. I mean, what were the effective stats? How many big blinds were in play? What were the blinds? Who was your opponent? You need to understand the context in order to make a decision, because as the big blinds decrease or increase, your decisions will change as well. So I think it's really important to consider that. And obviously, if you're playing a winning player or if you're playing a losing player, your decisions and assumptions will change as well. So keep that in mind. And yeah, I just wanted to mention that we're always looking at the amount of big blinds here. So yeah, so we get ace king suit, ace king offsuit out of position. Our opponent limps in, and at this point I just shove. This is the next hand after that 10-7 hand where he rivered a 10 on us. And I like to show, like, especially in this spot when I have a very good value hand, I do like to shove like this just to look against, especially against some recreational players who do think like this, that I'm going to show some frustration here by just shoving when he limps. I think that it could encourage a very marginal call. Like, for example, if he limped king 9, I think he could be encouraged to call, or king 10, just because of the previous hand and how he's perceiving my emotional state, or how he's perceiving my future actions based on that. And I think it plays well, obviously, all in. I think it dominates a ton of his limp calling hands. And I just don't think he's going to be calling too wide if I go ahead and make a smaller raise than this. And also, obviously, we're out of position, so it doesn't really facilitate things post-flop. But again, I mean, you have an ace-king hand here. So I'm just playing this. I remember playing this hand this way just because of the prior hand and just the flow of the match and how I think he might perceive my my decisions based on that. So he folds, and we take down the pot. So obviously, as you can see, we're running pretty good in this match. We picked up jacks, ace king, tens, and we're only about a couple hands in here. So pair of tens, we're going to go ahead and continue with our pre-flop raise, and our opponent jams, and we call. Pretty easy call, in my opinion, with 16 big blinds. We get a flop of ace jack 3, not the best flop, but our opponent had 7, so we were ahead the whole way, and obviously our decision was correct pre-flop. Pretty easy match, nothing too out of the ordinary. I think it's important to understand that, yes, we did run pretty good in this match. We're not going to hide that, but take it. I mean, you're not going to complain like, oh, you ran good, that was easy. I mean, we all run good, we all run bad. It's all the same for everybody. We all get good hands, we all get bad hands. So don't be afraid to acknowledge when you do well or when you run well. But I think the key in this match here is to understand that the decisions we made were pretty accurate throughout the whole match. And I think that's important. Win or lose in this match, if you would have flopped a 7 or whatever, it's important to understand that the decision-making process was pretty accurate. And I think a lot of people forget that. A lot of people neglect the fact that it all comes down to thought process and decision-making. If your thought process is accurate, your decision-making will be successful and very accurate as well. And regardless of your results, short-term, you will do well in the long term. And I think it's very important to stay level-headed in hypers, especially being a turbo player. So having played a different structure and now moving to a much faster structure with more variance, I think it's important to think along those lines, because if you're not level-headed and you're not thinking along the lines of thought process, decision-making, and forgetting the rest, if we focus on the things we can't control, like the bad luck or short-term profits or losses, we're going to be on an emotional roller coaster, and it's definitely not something you want to be on, because it doesn't really encourage good play. So that being said, if we focus solely on decision-making, thought process, and those things that we can control, and we make sure that if we're not making the right decisions, how can we improve those decisions, or how can we improve the thought process to make the right decisions, and focus on that aspect of it. Because we all know that if we do make the right decisions all the time, which is impossible, but the closer we get to making the right decisions more frequently, the more money we'll make in the long term. So if you focus on the things you can control, the money will come. You don't have to worry about that. The ROI will come. Again, you don't have to worry about that. Your graph will look great in the long run, so don't worry. So removing all this stress and all these emotional factors from it will really help you focus on your play, playing your best, and improving. And I think that's really key when we're considering a structure like this, where a lot of people are afraid to play hypers because of the fact that they've heard the stories of variance and emotional roller coasters and all that craziness. Being a turbo player myself, switching to hypers, I haven't had too much of a problem with the transition because I think that I've been focusing solely on decision making and thought process, knowing that, like I said, the profits will come in the future. So being patient and focusing on learning the game and understanding the game on a certain level is definitely going to help you get to where you want to be in the future, instead of focusing solely on winning profits, ROI, and getting so blindfolded by the fact that your numbers are good or numbers are bad that you don't put in the time to work on thought process early on. And then if you're going to downswing, how many people have quit or stopped playing because, oh, I run so bad, I have to switch games. So again, let's just focus on that. I'm going to open up a new game here and we'll keep going.